Hello everyone, I'm the 12th Women's World Chess Champion Alexandra Kostyniuk, and in this video we're going to talk about Rook versus Pawn endgames. Usually, Rook is a very strong piece, it fights for a win. But there are exceptions, as always in chess, and I'll start with this famous exceptional study where a pawn actually wins against a rook. It's white to move, it's a so-called Barbier-Saavedra studied. It first was published by Barbier a long time ago, and it was Black who was saving the game and making a draw, but in fact Saavedra, the Spanish priest Fernando Saavedra, later on proved that this position is one for white. So it's white to move, and white wins. C7, the only way to win if you have a pawn is to promote it into a queen. And surprisingly, the rook cannot stop this pawn. By c7, the pawn attacks the d8 square, the king is taking under control c5, so the rook cannot really stop the pawn, it needs to give a check. King b5, also quite unlogically, but the king runs away from the pawn, because if it goes up, then rook d7 will give a draw. So in order to win, white needs to leave his pawn on its own and go away from checks. And when the board is closer to its end, the king goes to c2. Why it doesn't go to the c file before that? Because, for example, if the king goes to c4 here, rook d1 will follow, and then rook c1 will be able to stop the pawn and make a draw. So king c2 is the correct way to play, and black does have one last trick, rook d4. If white promotes the pawn into a queen, it's gonna be a beautiful stalemate, and that was the first solution of this published study. But then, later on, it was proved that white can win using a very beautiful under-promotion. So in order to win, white needs to promote into rook. And because black king is standing so poorly in the corner, it gets under checkmating attack in the endgame. Okay, that happens. c8 rook, threatening a checkmate on a8. And if black protects by placing the rook on the a file, rook a4, king b3 follows with double attack. The rook is hanging, and rook c8 checkmate is about to be delivered on the next move. Very beautiful, very well-known study, but again, it's an exception. Usually in the endgames rook versus pawns, it's rook who is fighting for a win. And let's look at this example. Usually in order to win, rook needs the help of the king. But if the king is located on the 6th rank or on the 3rd rank for white, sometimes it can be left all on his own. For example, here rook g5 is simply winning the game because white rook just doesn't let black king to support his pawn. It's being cut off the king, and thus the position is lost. And it doesn't really matter where this king is standing. It can be located as far away as the square h8, but it still has time to move closer to the pawn, because if the pawn advances here, a3, then white can play rook g3, attacking the pawn, and after a2, rook a3, winning the pawn and the game. Let's go on. In this endgame, rook versus pawns. Actually, in many endgames we can say the same thing, but it's all about calculating how to figure out if this position is won or lost. It's about whether one side has time to stop this passed pawn or not. For example, here, if it's white to move, white is just in time to stop the pawn from being promoted and control the square and thus win the game. If it would be black to move, then it would be a draw, because black would start by pushing the pawn, e3, king b4, e2, king c3, e1, queen, and a draw. Also, when we talk about these endgames, we need to look at the position of both kings. And if the king of the stronger side is running from behind the pawn, it's not a very good position, except when we talk about side pawns with side pawns. This setup can be a winning one because, as we already seen in Rook versus Knight endgames, Knight doesn't save a weaker side when it's in the corner. And here, unfortunately for Black, if the pawn is promoted into a queen, it's a checkmate. If the pawn is promoted into a knight, it's a check. But the knight is lost in the next move. So the position is lost. But if the king of the stronger side is running from behind and the pawn is not a side pawn, but, and we've seen this example actually also in the Rook versus Knight video, it can help the weaker side to save the game, because here after g8 knight check, it's a drawn position, and I suggest you to go back to this Rook versus Knight video and check out how to make a draw here. So the best way for the stronger side to play for a win often is connected with the king taking a so-called side opposition, and in this particular case, White wins by playing king d6. White's plan is to take this side opposition and then deliver a check, and thus force this king to go and stop his own pawn. And thus, White wants time to bring his king even closer to the pawn and then win this pawn. So let's analyze this position. If Black tries to stop this king from coming, sometimes this is so-called shouldering happens. Unfortunately for Black, this maneuver doesn't help, because White uses another very useful maneuver to remember. They attack the pawn, and thus they force Black's king to go and protect his pawn, and thus open the road for the White king. King d5, g4, king d4, this races start, king f3, king d3, and there is a rule saying that if this side opposition is taken before this pawn reached the third or the sixth rank, if it's a white pawn, then it's a winning position. And here we see this is the case. If the pawn goes to g3, Black doesn't have time to save the game, because after rook f7 check, the king needs to get in front of the pawn, and thus White gets closer and White wins the game. So let's get back to the starting position. King d6 is the correct way, and again, in view of rook g7, if king goes to f4, then Black is not in time again. g3, rook f7, and the king goes to e2, and the pawn is lost soon. And in case of g4, same story. White is just in time to deliver this check and force this king to stop its own pawn. So White is winning here. So taking the side opposition can be quite important, and there is another very important idea which is called outflanking. So sometimes the king goes from one side, sometimes from another, but what's important, then it should not stay far away and just watch. This is the ending of a very famous Areti study, and White just played king to d7. Thus, this is what we call opposition, and we're gonna talk in more details in king and pawn versus king in pawns endgames video about this opposition. But opposition can happen in any chess game, and this is the case. White played king d7, and thus White forces Black king to go away, and thus opening one way or another for this king to improve his position. So if the king goes to e4, White king goes to c6, and just in time to attack the pawn and win the pawn. If the king goes to c4, White is just in time to get to the pawn from the other side, and it's a win for White. Another very useful maneuver to remember is this check, and then after the king goes away, rook g8, attacking the pawn, and thus winning time. It's a winning time maneuver, because if in the starting position White just goes to d3, after g3, rook f8, king e1, that's a very important move for the defending side to know never, I don't like to say never, but in most of the cases, don't block your own pawn because it just gives extra time to the stronger side. So try to avoid blocking your pawn, and this is the move and the idea to remember when you're trying to defend this kind of endgames. King e1 gives a draw here. So in order to win, white needs to win time, and they win time by giving this check and bringing the rook to g8. And after king f3, we have the side oppositions that we already discussed. And unfortunately for black, the king is not on f2. And after rook f8, it needs to block the pawn, king e2, and white is just in time to win it. But be careful, there is always stalemate tricks possible. So king f2 here, winning this pawn. And actually, one funny thing, when I was preparing this video, it was Title Tuesday, and there was a game that attracted my attention. Alexandra Goryachkina was playing against Federica Perez-Ponce. Of course, Title Tuesday, it's 3+1. It's hard to commentate, and games are playing on seconds, but still, I was quite shocked to see that Alexandra made a very serious mistake for her level. Let's see what happened in this game. So it's a rook versus side pawn. The king is quite far away of the stronger side, so it gives white enough time to make a draw, usually. So let's see how the game proceeded. a4, rook b1, king c6, rook a1, winning time maneuver, but unfortunately for black, it should not be enough to win the game because the pawn goes forward. a6, actually I don't like this move. It's still a draw, but well, it's intuitively I would suggest king b6, and in case of a6, it doesn't change the evaluation of the position. It's still a draw, king d5, king b6, but here after king d6, white has to go to b7 in order to save the game, and Alexander made the losing move. a7 is losing the game because of rook b1 check, king a6, and king to c7. And unfortunately, again for white, a8 knight doesn't save the game because the knight is in the corner. So in order to make a draw in this kind of situation, you should try to remember this move, king b7 first, after rook b1, in order to have king c8 move, and thus not stopping your own pawn. Because if you go to a8, then black wins by playing king c7, a7, king b6, king b8, rook h1. And again, the problem is that with the side pawn, this position is lost because the knight is lost after a8, knight check, king c6. So you have to be careful till the very end. And if you want to make a draw, make king b7, rook b1, and king c8. That's all what I wanted to share with you in this video. I wish you all the best in your games and see you in the next videos.